I am so happy to pass the virtual mic over to Dr. Jeanne Theoharis and Dr. Tera W. Hunter. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Cierra. And just, this is an exciting week for Cierra. I just wanted to hold up this week for you because Cierra's defending, I think, at the end of the week, right? So it's going to be great. But know that we're all going to be with you. So welcome, Professor Hunter. It is so great to have you. And I think where I wanted to start, and I think part of the impetus for tonight's session is there's been a lot of finally kind of coming to recognition of the crucial roles that Black women have played in our democracy and certainly played in these recent elections. But certainly your work takes that story not just back to the era that I talk about, which is the civil rights era, but much, much earlier. And we really wanted to start tonight with the 1881 Atlanta washerwomen strike, both to tell people a little bit about it for people who might not be familiar. But what does that give us to sort of seeing this long arc of kind of Black women's activism in terms of reshaping and making real this democracy?
First of all, thanks, Cierra and Jeanne, and thanks to the Zinn Ed Project in general for all the great work that you're doing. Thanks to everybody who's come out. It's great to see so many people interested in history and in this topic in particular. And thanks, of course, for inviting me. So let me just start with talking about domestic workers and then the strike, just to give people a little bit of background. So domestic workers included the maids, the child nurses, cooks, laundresses, and they engaged in the most intimate labor, the least desirable work, conducted in the homes of white families, especially in the South after emancipation. And Black women overwhelmingly dominated these positions. They were paid substandard wages. They were expected to work for very long hours, to endure insults, and sometimes even physical assaults to keep their jobs. Laundry work happened to be the position that they preferred, given the options, because it allowed them the most flexibility as they did the wash in their own homes and communities. And they were able to capitalize on their shared work sites and build solidarity, which they did in the summer of 1881. In July, the washerwomen, and we're talking about Atlanta, launched a citywide strike to improve their wages and to gain respect for their work. They mobilized supporters by going door to door. They had a few male allies along with them. And some of them were arrested in the process for disorderly conduct. They held meetings in local churches in which hundreds of people attended as their numbers grew. They formed what they call the Washing Society, which was a kind of cross between a labor union and a mutual aid organization. And they set up satellite groups throughout the city's 5 wards. When the strike broke out in July, the women faced a lot of opposition and ridicule from employers, from city officials, from businessmen, and the most vocal was the local newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution. But opponents who laughed initially were soon forced to admit that the nickname that they gave these women, the washing Amazons, actually proved to be more symbolic than derisive in terms of showing their effectiveness. These strikers defied stereotypes about being subservient workers. They overcame hurdles that was not expected of them. And the numbers of the strikers and their supporters grew to a few thousand within a month or so. And so what's remarkable is this was a group of marginalized workers, mostly illiterate women, wage earning women, and yet they organized the largest strike in the city's history. Now, the question is, did they win higher wages? We know that some did, but the complaint of low wages persisted, so probably not most. But what's more important is I think that they had a political victory in making their voices heard and asserting their rights. And one clear sign of this victory came a few months after the strike ended. They basically threatened to have a general strike of all the domestic workers in the fall of 1881, there was going to be this major event, the International Cotton Exposition. And so they threatened a strike for this first World's Fair that was being held in the South. Now, the strike would have been quite embarrassing and a black eye on the reputation of the city. And while the women didn't follow through and carry it out, the threat was taken seriously. So this essentially is the legacy of political organizing that's been passed down for generations. We saw some of this kind of organizing for Stacey Abrams when she was campaigning for governor a couple years ago. Hundreds of domestic workers who were affiliates of Care in Action, which is the political arm of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, knocked on doors in Atlanta neighborhoods to get out the vote for Abrams. Now they used modern technology, they traveled in minivans, they used their smartphones to basically identify and target the homes of voters of color, but they were walking in the footsteps of those washerwomen from over a century before. And Abrams, by the way, stood for many of the same issues that they have long fought for, that domestic workers have long fought for, such as the expansion of healthcare, living wages, and quality public education. So the washerwomen are an important reminder of the role that working class women have played in grassroots politics in the South and elsewhere, always in defiance of their marginalized economic and social status.
Thank you. And I think today I'm thinking about the kind of connections between the 1881 strike and then obviously the strike in Bessemer, and a number of people are down there in Bessemer doing that, holding that line, and the ways that often the most vulnerable workers are the ones that lead the way. So I guess we've started with the strike, but I wonder if you might tell us either about one or two organizers or another moment in this history that you bring out into Drive My Freedom, just in terms of teaching. I think one of the things we've talked about in this series before is that the ways that we often, there's this kind of gap between, maybe Reconstruction and then the Civil Rights Movement. And so maybe you could, again, introduce us to someone or a campaign that would help that sort of making it not just be a 70-year,
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to acknowledge is that the washerwomen in Atlanta were not alone in basically organizing strikes. In terms of domestic workers, there was one in Jackson, Mississippi in 1866, and there was another one in Galveston, Texas in 1877. Mm-hmm. Neither one of those was as impactful as the one in Atlanta, but they're still important. And one thing that's also very striking about all three of the strikes is that they took place in the context of a kind of a wider, flourishing grassroots political moment. In the case of the Jackson and Galveston strikes, during Reconstruction, but even with the Atlanta strike, it was happening in a period of, after Reconstruction ended, but African Americans were still very much engaged in politics. They were still active in the Republican Party. They had some significant momentum in that summer of 1881. So all of these women are building on political struggles. They were also building on other strikes that were happening in Jackson and Galveston. That was actually part of a larger national strike that was going on with men, wage earners, especially railroad workers. It's hard to identify any one woman. In terms of the Atlanta strike, we only know the names of the women who were arrested for disorderly conduct. But there is one person who I want to mention, who's also from Atlanta, who's a community organizer. And her name is Dorothy Bolden. And she was the daughter of a cook, and a laundress, and her father was a chauffeur. And she actually began helping her mother as a 9-year-old girl. And then throughout her adult life, she worked in various domestic jobs. Mm-hmm. She founded the National Domestic Workers Union in 1968. And this was a local organization primarily, but it grew out of her earlier organizing efforts. She had been involved in education issues and trying to get better schools for Black children in the city. Embolden used strategies that weren't that different from the washerwomen, updated for the times. She recruited women at bus stops, on the buses themselves, and also in neighborhood meetings. And like them, she also capitalized on the political context of what was happening. So for example, she worked with Martin Luther King during the Poor People's Campaign. She got his support before he passed away for the organization that she was building. And her work went beyond the South. She worked with domestic workers and with feminist allies in other cities to achieve benefits for domestic workers who had been excluded from a lot of the progressive labor laws that were passed during the New Deal of the 1930s. So they petitioned and they lobbied state legislatures and the federal government to get domestic workers included in the minimum wage laws in 1974 and in unemployment insurance in 1976.
Thank you. So one of my favorite chapters in To Joy My Freedom is a later chapter where you actually talk about, and it seems so relevant to where we are today, where you talk about Black women's kind of public health campaigns, both in terms of the kind of stigmatization the Black community was facing in terms of kind of the TB outbreak, and then the ways not only did they push back on that stigmatization, but the kind of public health work that they did. If you could tell us a little bit about that, what you think about it vis-a-vis today. I don't know, it just feels very resonant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely very relevant to what's happening right now. Just as Asian Americans have been stigmatized for spreading COVID-19, African Americans and specifically domestic workers were stigmatized for spreading tuberculosis in the 1910s. Now, TB, as it was called, was a prevalent disease across the nation, but in the Jim Crow South, it was called the Negro servants disease. So there was this idea among white residents that Black women and men who entered their homes as domestics were bringing in germs and contagion. Now, the reality was that was not true, obviously. Black people were not the sole carriers of TB, and nor were they the primary carriers of TB. But on the other hand, African Americans did suffer disproportionately to the disease because of poverty and Jim Crow. Black neighborhoods were literal dumping grounds for the garbage and sewage drained from the affluent neighborhoods, the homes of white people primarily, on elevated, higher land. They lacked running water, they lacked sanitary conveniences. So in response, African Americans created their own public health campaign to challenge the negative associations with the disease, but also to address the real public health issues. And among the most prominent activists was a group of women who organized the Neighborhood Union. This organization was started in 1908 by Eugenia Burns Hope. Hope was a teacher, social worker, community activist, and the wife of John Hope, who was the president of Morehouse College. And the Neighborhood Union sponsored lectures. They gave out information on disease prevention and care. They did their own research. They focused a lot of attention on women's issues, on maternal care in particular, on child care, on child health care issues. And most importantly, with respect to TB, they opened up community clinics. And so again, a parallel with today, we see Black physicians in different parts of the country doing the same thing. And so they use volunteer Black physicians and nurses to basically run those clinics that they operated in Black neighborhoods. The nucleus of the Neighborhood Union program was primarily that kind of self-activity, dealing with, sort of filling in the gaps where, the government and other organizations failed the Black community, but they were also advocates. They were very much engaged in pressing the government, the local government, the county government to do more, to do better. They lobbied for, paved streets, for, the city to take better care of the streets, the city to get rid of open sewers and to remove foul privies. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the neighborhood union, well, two things, is the way that it organized itself. They divided the city into neighborhoods, sort of sub-neighborhoods, and they put women in charge of each little cell. So that basically allowed them to be able to communicate very broadly with virtually every Black person in the city. But what it also do, it also broadened the leadership base. It made it necessary to include working class Black women, domestic workers in particular. And so it's very interesting that this was a cross-class alliance of women. There were domestic workers who were in the leadership of, who were officers within the, at the top of the hierarchy of the organization, as well as, the community neighborhood organizers. And so domestic workers, along with professional women and middle-class women like Eugenia Burns Hope, basically ran the neighborhood union. And that organization was also important in helping to start the social work program at Atlanta University. So that just shows the kind of impact that it had beyond the kind of work that it was doing in the early 20th century.
And I guess I think we know so little about this public health activism. And I think if people know anything, they point to, for instance, like the Black Panther Party medical programs. And I think, what do you think changes when we bring the timeline back and see that this is not just, it's not just the Panthers and the Young Lords in 1970, right?
Right. I mean, I think it just tells you that African Americans have been mobilizing on every front, right? We've been mobilizing on all the issues that that face us, be it healthcare, be it economic issues around jobs or the lack of jobs or political rights. And so I think that's one of the things that it shows is there's this long legacy of African American political activism on every issue that we can dream up today. They've already done it in decades and centuries past.
Right. Which brings us to a kind of another aspect of To Join My Freedom, which is the ways that you also center the leisure and the struggle for leisure. Obviously, in a book that foregrounds labor struggles, that foregrounds public health struggles, you also put leisure right next to those as a key site of struggle, a key area of freedom. And so I guess I would want you to tell us a little bit about those struggles for leisure and what was crucial in them, and also what it means to put them alongside and why you put them alongside like labor and public health and why we need to.
Yeah, so when I started conceptualizing To Join My Freedom, which began as my dissertation, one of the first things that interested me is I wanted to really write about these women as full dimensional human beings. So a lot of the earlier work, the earlier scholarship on domestic workers was really not interested in the women themselves. It was more interested in the households that they worked in, the middle class households, the upper class households. So the domestics were sort of appendages, in those homes, in the way that scholars sort of thought about them. They weren't really interested in them as people. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to write about these women as people, as workers, as mothers, as wives, as sisters, as friends, to look at their, involvement in churches and secular organizations, and also to look at their leisure activities. And what I found was domestic workers were eager participants and consumers of all the popular culture events and venues that were available during their time. Vaudeville shows, fairs, silent movies, holiday celebrations. But the activity that was probably most popular and also most controversial was public dancing. So there were these public dance halls, also known as juke joints, that were places where people, would go and dance. But they were often associated with other kinds of activities that were considered illicit, like gambling or drinking and prostitution. So part of the controversy had to do with the proximity of, where these dances took place. And so there's a lot of pushback from city officials starting in the 1890s. They started to call for the removal and the outlaw of what they call the Negro dance halls. They saw them as, crime breeders and disgrace to the city. And in this instance, it's not just white public officials, it's also leading African Americans who are also opposed to these for reasons that you might suspect, having to do with respectability politics. So there were several of those, one particular minister in particular who took a leading role in denouncing these sites. And they were also critical, not just of the locations and what was happening, in proximity, but also with the dancing itself. And so, first of all, you have women and men, dancing together, which was somewhat, of an issue because at the time, sort of respectable company would have invited dancing, but just to have like a public place where anyone could go, where women and men would intermingle freely was considered disreputable. And then you have the kinds of dancing that they were doing, which some call provocative, sexually provocative. One of my favorite dances that was called out was called the funky butt. So that gives you some sense of the kind of suggestiveness that these working class people freely engaged in. Employers of domestic workers were also noticeably critical of these dance halls. They saw them as standing in the way of a good work ethic. They wanted the women to spend their time after work resting to get ready for the next day of work. And obviously they felt entitled to tell the workers what to do outside of work, to control their bodies for the labor that they as employers benefited most from.
Right. And I think I think what you do in the book is also, and I think both you and Rob and Kelly have been really trailblazers in showing us the kind of full range of people's freedom dreams, right? That freedom is certainly having a living wage. It's certainly having decent working conditions. It's certainly not being sick. But that if we're going to talk about freedom, it seems like partly what you're asking us to think about in the book is a kind of the full menu of freedom.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, the title of my book is kind of a literal phrase, to joy my freedom, right? Joy in all of its forms, to joy. And it's a quote from a recently freed woman whose former slave owners asking her, basically, how are you going to cope? Why would you want this? Trying to basically talk her down from, her aspirations. And she's saying, to enjoy my freedom, meaning to enjoy her freedom. That's why she wanted to be free. And so that meaning of joy and enjoyment meant above all autonomy, above all not to be treated as an enslaved person and to have all the freedoms that free people actually took for granted, to be able to work or not to work, to be able to enjoy their time in leisure activities that gave them pleasure.
So one of the things, I write about it and like to think about are the stories that we get, the reasons we get the myths we get. And I think in the 20 years since your book was published, I think the teaching of Reconstructionists and the era of after Reconstruction has certainly gotten a lot better. But I guess one of the things I wanted you to talk to us about is what you think some of the myths still remain, misimpressions, some of the problems in the ways that we imagine Reconstruction and the period after Reconstruction, You know, that's, and then, and why you think those are there, because again, just like the political uses of the myths we still
Yeah.
have about that era.
Yeah, I would love to hear from the teachers about this to get an up-to-date view on what's being taught, what's not being taught. But I still don't think we have, that we fully appreciate the monumental moment that Reconstruction represents. Du Bois called it a splendid failure. And part of what made it splendid is that Reconstruction engaged the broad participation of recently freed people in political mobilizations that were designed to make freedom and democracy real. African Americans were active participants in efforts to secure the vote, to run for office, to use their collective power to help America live up to its ideals, those ideals outlined going back to the Declaration of Independence. And they fought for rights, not just for themselves, but for everyone. And so one of the things that is a sign of this is that they supported public education. They were among the biggest proponents of providing public education in the South, making free schools open to all, which before Reconstruction did not exist. One of my favorite articles, and that kind of captures some of these issues, is written by Elsa Barkley Brown, and it's about the Black public sphere. I can provide that citation later, but it's about Richmond, Virginia. And she allows us to see what was happening, you know, at the grassroots in this particular city, with, you know, all kinds of individuals and groups, starting in the Reconstruction period and then stretching it into the 20th century. But we get a chance to see women and men and children, working class people, middle class people, secular organizations, religious institutions, political parties, all engaged in the period of Reconstruction. And then, you know, going beyond and looking at some of the tensions that emerge as well around gender and class. Another thing that I think is perhaps neglected still about Reconstruction is that we don't pay enough attention to why it failed, or how it failed, and that violence was behind it. Like there was a deliberate effort to, you know, end Reconstruction, and it didn't just, you know, come to an end on its own. And so political violence was a key factor in American politics, especially in the South during Reconstruction. And the Ku Klux Klan played a very pivotal role in terrorizing African Americans, as well as white Republicans, using intimidation, destroying property, assaulting, murdering African Americans and their allies, to prevent them from voting, to prevent them from participating in politics and otherwise expressing their rights. And so that led to a congressional investigation of these incidents, and it led to the passage of the KKK Act of 1871, which was just recently referenced in a lawsuit that was filed by Representative Benny Thompson on behalf of those like himself who were basically being terrorized by the insurrectionists on the Capitol this past January. And so I think that moment of violence is really important, and we have great sources to tell that story for teachers to look at. We have the congressional investigations of the KKK, literally volumes of testimony, including African Americans, you know, who took risks to go and testify about what they were being, about the ways in which they were being victimized.
So I wanted to like geek out a little bit, partly because one of my favorite talks that I heard you give many years ago when you were just starting Bound in Wedlock was a talk about sources. And in many ways, part of what you and kind of our generation of scholars did was push back against this idea that there were certain histories, like those of Black marriage during slavery, that we would just never be able to know. And I think people like you and many others refuse to sort of just say, okay, they're just things we can't know. They're just things we can't study. But what I loved about this talk was the ways that you talked about then how you were going about it. And I think, and I certainly know this community of teachers loves to hear about the sources. So either with Bound in Wedlock or To Joy My Freedom, just if you could tell us a little bit about how you moved past, again, these kinds of messages that I think many older generation historians had, right? Of just like, that's an impossible story to tell. There's not the sources.
Mm-hmm. So I'll start by comparing To Joy My Freedom and Bound in Wedlock, because, literally I was told that you couldn't write the book that I wrote, To Joy My Freedom, because of the lack of sources. So I had to be very strategic in terms of the way that I approached the subject. When I would go to archives, I wouldn't go and say, can you show me your archives on domestic workers? Because they would say, we don't have such records. So, I had to be very creative in, the kinds of records that I wanted to look at, to try to find those, often, little bits and pieces of evidence that I found in lots of different places that one would not expect to find material on, Black women, especially Black women workers. So with To Joy My Freedom, I was really having to work with a scarcity of sources. Whereas with Bound in Wedlock, I would say the opposite was the case, where I had abundance, in part because of the scope was different. Bound in Wedlock is based on the entire 19th century. It's not regionally specific, so it covers, much of the nation. And so it's a much bigger, broader book. So that also left room for having many more sources. But what's also interesting is that I started research for Bound in Wedlock in a particular set of sources, the Freedmen's Bureau records. And when I finished writing To Joy My Freedom and was thinking about revisions and going back and doing more research, I did some more research in the Freedmen's Bureau records at the Freedmen and Southern Society Project at the University of Maryland. And as I was going through those records, I kept coming across more and more about marriage and family. And I kind of put those aside thinking, well, maybe I'll write an article, that really kind of extends what I did in To Joy My Freedom, just focusing on Reconstruction, dealing with marriage and family. But what I ultimately decided to do was that what those documents revealed to me was the importance of actually going backwards and looking at slavery. And then also going forward and looking towards the end of the 19th century. But literally, I felt like I had to write about the entire 19th century to really reckon with the complexity of the records from the Freedmen's Bureau, which, we have this unprecedented treasure trove of records coming from that period, free people speaking about their experiences under slavery, as well as in freedom. And with respect to marriage and family, I felt like that complexity had not yet been reflected in the books that have been published. So giving more texture to the emotional side of African-American family dynamics, especially the emotional side of men's lives, for example, in terms of their family relationships. Thinking more about how gender was a contested issue in the context of marriage. And also thinking about the importance, like how central Black families were to Black survival and how they fought tooth and nail for those families, willing to sacrifice their lives if necessary to defend those families. So all of those things encouraged me to sort of think about, going back to really reconsider slavery and marriage under slavery and family under slavery, and then going forward into the end of the 19th century. And then another set of records I'll mention, the Bound in Wedlock is based on lots of different other kinds of sources, legal records, lots of personal papers, lots of autobiographies, et cetera. But one of my favorite sources, aside from the Freedmen's Bureau records, also coming from this period though, are the Civil War widow pension files. And so these were documents that were generated by veterans, widows of Civil War veterans. So for the Black men who fought for the United States during the Civil War, their wives and children were entitled to pensions. In order to qualify for those pensions, they had to document their marriages under slavery. They couldn't produce, licenses because marriages were not legalized. So they had to give sort of testimony, kind of narrative testimony, explaining, the context of their relationships, how they were known as a married couple. And they would bring in witnesses to testify that they had been married or they considered themselves married, even though it wasn't legal. And so you had this rich, texture of these women describing their relationships, under slavery, during the Civil War. You also have cases where they're competing widows, where there's more than one widow claiming the same man. Those were always the most interesting files. And then there's a lot of contention because the widows were supposed to remain single in order to keep their pensions. Once they qualified for pensions, they were not supposed to remarry. They were not supposed to cohabit with men. And of course they did. And then there were investigations. People who were willing to talk to investigators spilled the beans. And so all of these records are really interesting because they give us a sense of the lives of these women, dating from slavery, where they describe their relationships under slavery during the Civil War. And at the end of the 19th century, when they're, getting the pensions and they're defending their pensions and going into the 20th century. And so for some widows, you have this long record of, multiple relationships over the course of, the mid to, late 19th century and into the 20th century. And these are records that are located in the National Archives, but some of them are now available. They've been digitized and they're available at ancestry.com. They're amazing records.
Yeah, so please put in the chat, particularly if there were questions, and I will be checking the chat for questions. And just, let us know how your breakout room was, what issues you talked about. So one question, as people are coming back, that we had in the chat before we left, was the question of whether these women got fired for any of their work, at their labor work, their work around leisure, their work for public health work, or kind of what other sorts of punishment or sanctions they might have faced.
Yeah, so in terms of the strike, for sure, there were some people who were threatened with losing their clients. And keep in mind, like the washerwomen weren't, like traditional domestic workers. They didn't go in the homes of employers. So they were, they had more of a client, what do you say? What's the other word? The opposite. The white families were more like clients. Mm-hmm. But yes, there were people who threatened, with their washerwomen, participated in the strike, that they weren't going to, patronize them. And so there were some of those incidents that happened. The problem is, as a historian, we're really relying on the newspaper. So that's really the source for the strike. And they don't give us, every single detail about what happened. But there were other reprisals that were tried as well. I mean, they threatened, to basically create competition for them. They were going to create this fancy commercial laundry to put them out of business. So they came up with all kinds of things to try to discourage the women from actually, carrying out the strike, but not very much was effective in the short term. Mm-hmm. And in the long term, they were actually really committed to manual labor. They really didn't want those commercial laundries, those commercial laundries. They actually lagged behind development compared to the North. In the North, they were happy to switch to machines doing the work. In the South, they still wanted to have Black women perform that work.
Thank you. A couple of people asked a couple different questions in the chat related to this. Both, did the Black press cover the strike? and also kind of what was the relationship between the strike and other unions or labor activism of more both elite African Americans, but also other white labor unions?
In terms of other labor unions, there's no evidence of other labor unions supporting the strike or being against the strike. The strike did actually inspire other workers to organize, though. There were waiters at a local hotel that basically had their little work stoppage as a result of the strike. So there are definitely other workers who were inspired by the washerwomen more than sort of unions coming to support them. But it was also something that was widely supported within the Black community. And in terms of newspapers, we only have the Atlanta Constitution, which was the white daily, the same Atlanta Constitution there is today. But back then they made no shame about like just being boldly racist, just like blatantly racist in the editorials as well as the way they reported the news.
So I had a question going back to the public health. I guess I wanted to hear a bit more about how the women kind of pushed back against the stigmatization, because I think sometimes we are not so good at being able to imagine how activism can sort of doesn't just provide. Obviously, they also were doing important things in terms of providing community services around public health, but also to push back on a kind of broader public demonization and stigmatization around TB. And so I guess I just wanted to hear a bit more.
Yeah, so first of all, if you get it, I think all of you are going to get a copy of my book, yay. So when you do, you'll see there are political cartoons in the book. So they're pictures of the ways in which domestic workers were caricatured for spreading tuberculosis. They're viciously racist, just viciously racist. So there are all kinds of ways in which these women were being talked about, in the newspapers, in narrative form, as well as, visual representations of these women as, contagious, spreading germs. And so we don't have a lot from the women themselves. Again, the evidence is not really there in terms of like, how did domestic workers themselves respond? But what we do have are the responses from African-American public health experts, professionals, physicians, for example, just like directly challenging, criticizing these claims that are being made, about Black women spreading disease, making the corrections about, how disease actually spreads, but also just really challenging the racist assumptions behind the ideas that would say somehow Black women are responsible for white folks' disease. That's a quote. I was trying to find the exact quote for that physician saying that, but something to the fact that it seems really strange that Black women are being charged with spreading white folks' disease. So those were the kinds of responses that we get. It's mainly from the people who have a platform, the professionals who have a platform to directly take on their counterparts.
So last week we saw Senator Warnock give his sort of this, everybody was calling it his maiden speech, which I found to be a weird phrase. And he did a very powerful thing, which is that he sort of gave the country both a kind of sermon and history lesson about the long sort of history of voting rights activism and voter suppression. And one of the things I always appreciate about him is that he never mentions John Lewis without mentioning Amelia Boynton, and sort of that, and calling out the activism of women in the civil rights movement. But certainly your work helps us go even earlier. And then on top of that, we've obviously been having kind of the centennial of the 19th Amendment and a long needed conversation about the role of Black women in the struggle for sort of the right to vote for women, and in the ways that right didn't include everyone. So I was hoping you could give us a bit more of that earlier history.
Yeah, so I think thinking about women's rights to vote is a really good way for studying suffrage, both as it relates to women, as it relates to African Americans. And so we've had all these conversations over the last year or so, celebrating the anniversary of the ratification, and that happened in this past August. And I think that's helped to call attention to, the significance of voting rights for women, but also the fact that Black women were largely excluded, as were other women of color. And partly that had to do with, well, not partly, it had to do with the Jim Crow laws. The same laws that prevented Black men from voting also prevented Black women from voting. So you have poll taxes, you have grandfather clause, you have literacy tax. So all of those provisions were used in the South, especially to keep women from voting the same way that Black men were kept out of the polls. So Martha Jones's new book is great on this. Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, won the vote. There was someone here who was a student of Rosalind Terborg Penn that he mentioned earlier in the introduction before we got started. She was a pioneering scholar. She taught at Morgan State, and she started working on these women voters and women, not women voters, but women voting rights activists, going back to the antebellum period. She started working on that in the 1970s. And so we have this very long history stretching from the antebellum period into the 20th century. And I think it's a great way for teachers to teach about Voting Rights Act, because you have this large time frame. There are great primary sources, speeches, essays, newspaper articles, memoirs, because there's so many women. I think when Terborg Penn did her research, she found 120 Black women, up to 1920. So since then, historians have found many, many more women. And then what's great is that a lot of these women were involved on multiple fronts, again, attacking racism, sexism, classism, all the isms, in being a part of multiple organizing efforts. Someone like Ida B. Wells Barnett, she was the leading anti-lynching advocate. She was a founder of the NAACP. She was, very active in women's organizations. She was a suffragist as well. Of course, Jeanne, your work on Rosa Parks, she was doing work in the 1940s around voting. A lot of the women that we know from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, they started with voting rights decades earlier. So I think we can use the history of women's vote to look at the ways that it intersects with the history of African-American voting rights and the history of other people of color as well.
Thank you. So one question we always like to kind of often end with is a question about are there a couple of things, and I have a whole list of things that I am frustrated that students don't know when they get to me about the civil rights movement, Black freedom struggle in the post-war era. But I guess I would love to hear a couple of things that maybe you are frustrated by that students don't know that you wish they knew. And maybe, again, reasons for optimism, things that you are pleased that people now know that, again, we didn't, because certainly there are things that also are like, whoa, I wish that I knew that by, before I got to college, before I got to grad school, before I got to like 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I would say the good thing is I feel more optimistic. I feel like compared to when I first started teaching, just a few years ago, actually more than that. When I first started teaching, I felt like there was so much that students weren't learning, whereas now I feel like they're coming with a better sense of history. So I don't feel like I'm always having to make up for deficits or correct misconceptions in the way that I did, 20 years ago. But on the other hand, I still feel like the three areas where I feel like they still know the least or have misconceptions about are slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. So those three are, and those are the areas that they're usually the most, surprised by themselves when they come into class and they learn things they've never learned before and completely just rocks their worlds.
Right.
So those are the areas I think that that need to be covered better in schools. And we see this not just, in terms of college students, but we see this in the public discourse in terms of what's lacking, which reflects, what they learned in high school, or if they went to college, perhaps what they didn't learn there as well.
Right. And I think people want to know what you're working on now.
Well, one of the things I'm working on is kind of grows out of Bound in Wedlock. So Bound in Wedlock focused on the 19th century, but the epilogue jumps into the 20th century. So when I was writing about slavery and marriage, the issue that always comes up is, what about things that are happening in more recent times? So I felt like I had to address that, which I do in the epilogue. And also because there's so many misconceptions about African-American family life, about Black marriage patterns in the 20th century, and how much slavery has to do with those patterns and how much slavery doesn't. So I felt like there was no way to write a book about the 19th century without addressing the 20th century in some way. So I did that in an epilogue, but I'm now thinking about doing another project that looks just at the 20th century. And I'm struggling a bit because I don't want to do what I just did. I'm not going to spend another 15 years, writing a comprehensive study of a century of history. So I am thinking more episodically, of course, the 20th century, and looking at the politics of Black families, the ways that we talk about the family, the ways that the family has been implicated in so much of public policy that we take for granted or underestimate the role that the family plays in our sort of public policy, public discourse about race. And then thinking about the what I call the marriage, the racial marriage gap, how it is that we started at the beginning of the 20th century with African Americans marrying slightly more than whites, and how we end the 20th century with that pattern reverse, with African Americans marrying significantly less than white Americans.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm going to bring Cierra back in a sec, but I just wanted to express my gratitude for you joining us tonight. We created this series a year ago in many ways to create kind of community, and the pandemic had both opened up opportunities to get out of the textbook and also need for online resources, for ways to be together and to share sort of learning and tips. And so we're just really fortunate that you, Professor Hunter, could be with us tonight and again, bring us sort of back into the 19th century for some of this kind of long Black freedom struggle. Thank you. And Cierra.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. It was fun. And I look forward to hearing feedback from the teachers.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now to everyone who has attended the session, we would love your feedback on the content and the format. We've placed the feedback form in the chat box. But as you do the evaluation, please unmute yourself and share your thank yous to Dr. Theoharis and Dr. Hunter for this really moving conversation that they had today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
They've both left us with so much to think about and
Thank
so
you,
much
guys.
to
Goodbye.
further explore. And thank you to everyone here for your commitment to learning and teaching people's history. Thank you to our facilitators. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our ASL interpreters. We appreciate you. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the resources that were referenced here today. And then now please mute yourself again to complete the evaluation. Thank you so, so much for joining us. And thank you again, Dr. Hunter, for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Theoharis, for leading and facilitating this conversation.